Welcome to the Democracy's College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. In this episode, Dr. Eboni Zamani-Gallaher from OCCRL will talk with Dr. Dian Squire, a visiting assistant professor at Iowa State University, about reframing racial justice.
Welcome, Dr. Squire.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. We wanted to talk to you about your research. In particular, through your research, you advocate for diversity, equity, and justice in higher education. Can you describe what diversity, equity, and justice mean to you, as well as share with us the importance of achieving each?
I'd like to have actually pretty specific definitions of diversity, equity, and justice that I utilize that help kind of bracket my work, and I think these might be helpful for other folks in thinking about the work that they do. Diversity to me is a lexical tool, and it characterizes the structural representation of multiple marginalized societal groups. Those who are not white, not male, not European in ancestry, able-bodied, native-born, English language speaking, binary gender identifying, Christian and heterosexual. And that's also within a given institutional context and geographical context. So there's a lot of bracketing that's kind of going on there. Equity to me refers to thinking about institutional policies, programs, and practices that are free from discrimination, bias, and inequalities, as well as democratic decisions that equilibrate opportunity and remove social oppression based on past imbalances and prior and present negating circumstances. I think we also have to take some asset-based approaches, so highlight positive, important, and centralizing experiences of all of our community members. For me, justice is deliberate and democratic, equitable action, both done collectively and also individually, that moves us towards education as a public good. I kind of envision those three things, diversity, equity, and justice, as acting in a three-way relationship, where diversity can exist independently, but really if we are going to formulate rich environments, we also need to be thinking about equity and justice as playing a role in that. When they're understood separate from each other, it's much harder for us to create critical masses of diverse bodies, create strong communities, and decrease marginalization for underrepresented groups. It's a mutualistic, symbiotic relationship between diversity, equity, and justice. I think these are important because we have a history of oppression, starting with the colonization of our lands, forced slavery of African people in our country, and a country that was built on and continues to be fueled by the bodies of people of color. And there isn't really a doubt about this fact, despite what people may think or might not know. So we really have to rectify our past, we have to do better, and realize the marginalizations that are continuing today, and treat people as humans.
Thanks, Dr. Squire. With the way in which you've described diversity, equity, and justice, how do you see that playing out a little differently based on educational tier? Here at OCCRL, we're about looking at how diverse youth and adults transition into, through, and out of community colleges in particular. But as you think about K-12 as well as post-secondary, are there ways in which we should advocate for diversity, equity, and justice similarly, or in ways that are different based on that tier of education and learner?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different because when we think of higher education institutions, there are obviously much fewer of them in the country, so the geographical context will maybe be a little bit more nuanced within a given district. I think who and where K-12 schools will draw students from will be different. Mm-hmm. And so the work of equity and justice, I think, will also be different within those contexts as far as the types of work that you might do with students and how we think about how diverse groups interact with each other. I do think that the work of thinking about diversity and equity and justice should be similar because we live in a country where we will all interact with each other at some point as we move out of those K-12 systems. But I think that the implementation of programming of policies would look more nuanced on a K-12 level. However, it is somewhat cyclical in a way in that universities are training administrators, they're training teachers to go out into these fields. And so while some of the work might be implemented differently on a K-12 level, we still have to do our work at a higher ed level to ensure that those folks are doing really good learning when they're with us, in the college classroom. So when they go out into the K-12 settings, that they can do just as good work with the students that are out there. I mean, I think the work of diversity, equity, and justice, I look at it from an institutional level, but, there's policy levels as well that can be addressed. While I don't do that specifically, there's obviously a lot of thinking around funding and districting and privatization of schools that all have impacts on student learning and development in K-12, and the ability for us to create equitable opportunities in those systems that need to be addressed as well.
One of the things that we have been bearing witness to, particularly over the days and weeks post-election, is heightened tensions, and it appears there's an era that has heightened racial tensions as of late. What do you see as the role of colleges and universities in creating learning environments that support racially diverse collegians?
I think universities have a unique opportunity to intentionally and purposefully engage people across difference. I mean, we know from our research that cross-cultural engagement leads to many positive outcomes for a pluralistic society. And I think in some ways we've kind of rested on our laurels of having, 30% students of color on our campuses and expecting that the work of equity and justice is done. And, as I said earlier, diversity is not enough, and the role has to be multiple folds. I think that there's a couple ways that colleges can create learning environments that support racially diverse collegians at the intersections of their identities, right? We can admit, hire, and retain students, faculty, and staff of color, and think of those people across the intersections of their identities, including gender, sex, ability, immigration status, among many other things. And not just have faculty of color for the sake of having faculty of color, or anybody for the sake of having that diversity, but because they're the best people at engaging student learning, engaging communities, are people who are going to have meaningful work that reshapes society positively. And then we have to reward those people for doing that work. Another thing universities can do is find ways to train faculty and other instructors to integrate more diverse curriculums and pedagogies that reflect students in their classrooms, and even those who aren't in their classrooms. Once again, geography, plays a part in it, and sometimes we won't have certain groups of students in our classrooms, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about them and how we might support them. We can also ensure that we're being proactive in understanding major issues of our day and doing something about them instead of being reactive, as we often are. So, for instance, why do we have to wait for the president to threaten to deport our students before we're willing to say that we care and protect them? Because we know that the threat of deportation has always been imminent. And I think we also have to return to an engaged university status where we can't really continue to stand on the sidelines anymore when major national issues are occurring in our backyards. We used to have presidents who were really strong and made big statements, and their statements had impact. And I think, once again, our social justice focus needs to be directed outward. And then administrations need to work and support people who are doing that work on the college campuses, hire people who are doing that good work, and support students who want to study, and also engage with community members who are doing some of that work as well. So become a little bit more community-oriented, support folks who are doing good social justice work that can be focused outward as well. I guess a couple other things that I think universities can do to support racially diverse students is create opportunities for people to engage across difference in more meaningful ways and not be afraid to stand up for our values. Don't be pressured by neoliberal pressures. So, we can't just have diversity in our mission statements because it brings students in, and I talked a little bit about this, right? We have to live our mission, our vision, our values in every way possible. And if we're being really radical, and I sort of brought this up in my talk a little bit, we could deconstruct all of our universities and start from scratch with everybody being at the table to try and create the most equitable university as possible. But that's probably not going to happen in our time. But those are some of the things that come to my mind immediately when I think about supporting diverse racial collegians.
Do you see this play out differently with minority-serving institutions, say, for instance, historically black universities and colleges, HBCUs, as opposed to predominantly white institutions? Are the roles different, you think?
One thing that's really been interesting and exciting is that at HBCUs in particular, we're seeing growth enrollment, right? And it's not just enrollment of Black students, it's enrollment of students across a large group of, racial categories. And I wouldn't be surprised if this growth continues time. And HBCUs we know are extremely successful at cultivating environments that are broadly inclusive across race, at stimulating core understandings of Blackness in America, at graduating large numbers of PhDs, cultivating, grand thinkers and creative leaders, thought leaders, and I think that their subsistence is of the utmost importance for our country. But there is still work to be done on those campuses. There's still continuing concerns around relationships between international African students, and more prevalent in the news, inclusivity around LGBT and trans communities on those campuses. So we see lots of pieces coming out about that more recently. While there is positive movement in HBCUs, and I think a lot to learn from them, many of these universities are also deeply embedded with values that can be oppressive to certain groups that we don't often think about. Some of that it comes out of some religious values. So these are some tensions to be teased out and discussed, I think. For those of us who don't do work directly with HBCUs or full-time in HBCUs, I think our work is to better understand the value of HBCUs and to recognize the importance of these institutions in society, and also to support them socially and financially in any ways that we can. If we look at the movement for Black Lives, they've called for tuition-free education, removal of debt, and a full funding of public HBCUs as part of their platform. And so, I would support these demands and, work within my scope of influence to forward that message and, try and get those policies passed. I think we can look to some great scholars in the field of higher ed, in particular some new scholars that do work on HBCUs, and some new folks that kind of come to mind are Dr. Steve Mobley at the University of Alabama and Dr. Felicia Commodore at Old Dominion, who are doing some good work as well as that we can look toward.
As you talk about student movements, in particular Black Lives Matter, what's the role of faculty, staff, administrators in response to student activism and in responding to racial inequities?
Well, I think the roles that faculty, staff, and students play are different, though I think namely students would think that there should be a homogeneity of activism, and this was kind of the back end of my talk. I also just want to give a shout out to Dr. Veronica Jones at University of Texas San Antonio and the students that we both worked with across our time for kind of thinking through some of this stuff. Because I think that the restrictions that racism and white supremacy place on people in the academy do so differently, and so therefore there is a heterogeneity of activism that we have to take into consideration. So I think a traditional ask on faculty and staff of color to engage in activist work can be an ask that is both based in classism and ableism, and potentially devoid of an analysis of racism fully. And then I mentioned some other constrictions as well, such as positionality, alignment of concerns or philosophy on race and racism, and racial consciousness of faculty and staff. So ultimately, I think faculty and staff and students need to talk to each other more and also extend a little grace, which can be, we need to bring each other along in the process. Really kind of educate each other on what our goals and missions and abilities and opportunities are. That being said, students do have power to still engage administrators, disrupt the normal order of things. And we've seen students bring to national prominence campus concerns and make really important changes on their campuses. So activism, is, I think, positive, and we've seen it be a positive tool on college campuses. We just need to kind of nuance it a little bit more when thinking about the different types of people and how they engage. I think faculty and staff can help students navigate hierarchies and bureaucracy, which are often used to, help quell dissent. And I also think one other thing we need to think about is that I think it's a misnomer to assume that action-based activism is present on all campuses at the level that we see on TV and in the news. And I don't find this to be the case in the university, some of the universities that I've been at. So sometimes the role of faculty and staff might be to help prepare students to engage in some of that work, teaching them how to organize or bring to light through either teaching or, meetings, issues that are present in the university, and to do some of that consciousness raising as well, because I don't think that activist bug is there all of the time.
So what do you consider the cost to those that are activists? Is there a cost to those that are perceived as activists?
Yeah, I think there's obviously potential for material cost and loss, such as around employment or access to opportunity. So I think that those are always pieces that need to be weighed. A lot of emotional costs, and that's what I've been talking to my students a lot about this semester, particularly towards the end of the semester. What are kind of these emotional costs, and how are they feeling when they're trying to just survive in institutions, and then as they do in certain ways engage in activism or are restricted from engaging in activism. So particularly for me, I teach graduate students, master's students, some who come from very strong activist backgrounds in their undergraduate days, but are now in graduate assistantships as part of the university, and they're not able to engage in the same types of movements in the same ways as they were before. So they talk a lot about being exhausted and frustrated and angered and demoralized and hopeless. And so, I think the range of emotions is vast and it's tiring, and I think that we have to think about how we might engage in shifting some of those emotions into actionable outcomes. So sometimes we need faculty and staff to do some of that work. We need counselors and therapists, and students need other students to do that work. Because sometimes these emotions are directed at outsiders who are holding students and faculty and staff back, but sometimes it's also directed rightly or wrongly at people who are, in coalition with them, or people who are insiders, quote unquote. So I think it's important to discuss the emotions and be authentic and be open, as to not engage in inner turmoil that will kind of disrupt the movement, whatever that movement might be. And I think also, I talked about this a bit, but there are some negative costs when we think of activism as negative and having a negative connotation, and that's assumed to be facing outward or should only be faced outward from the university, whereas engagement is always seen as positive and also facing outward. So we have to change the ways that we conceptualize engagement and activism, because I think we can see that students who are marginalized or in coalition with marginalized groups will engage in activism often face inwards at the university, and that's seen negatively, and therefore there are repercussions for these people. Whereas folks who maybe are more privileged, have opportunities to travel abroad and do volunteerism and things like that, and that's seen as positive engagement, they might get different benefits or be seen in different ways. So there's some sort of changing of the dynamic and, how we conceptualize engagement and activism that needs to happen as well.
So before we close, if you were to give a call to action, what would you like to issue for those listening today who would want to take a more active role in advocating for racial justice?
The first thing I would say is to learn more about the history of this country. And I think that's one piece that we often leave out. And that's something that takes a lot of time and energy. But if we aren't willing to learn about our colonial, racist, and white supremacist past and present, then I think we're really limited in the ways that we can help change the country. I think we'll continue to just implement very liberal policy changes that don't really change anything at the core. I think we also need to think intersectionally and read works that take strong intersectional lenses around race and gender and international status and ability and others that we can think of. And I think that when we think of academia, so for any faculty or graduate students who are listening, or other students, that work is not always located in our academic journals. In some fields it is, but I think we should also look outside of our journals and read blogs like those on the Black Lives Matter website or the Brown Boy Project website and other sorts of intersectional organizations, local organizations, and movement blogs that folks might be familiar with. And then I think the amount that we can learn from those is vast because the information is out there, and this also relieves some of the communities from doing this educational work over and over again because we can just read what's already been written out there. I think we need to listen to other stories and believe them, provide opportunities for people to share their experiences, and then don't talk. Let's listen. Let's go to speaker series. Let's go to something I've never thought that I would care about or attend normally and just learn and not have to say something all the time. I think we need to use our privileges where we can, whenever we can. I don't think we have time to be silent anymore. And I think we can, particularly I'm thinking as a faculty member, think about how we nuance our activism into the various locuses of control that we have. And, I think as faculty, I'm always thinking about, how do I balance an activist identity with an identity that is in a lot of ways controlled by a bureaucracy and a hierarchy and various levels of power and, and tenure and all these things. So I have to figure out how do I nuance that the best and what am I willing to give up or not. But I think we do need to leverage as much power as we can and take some of those risks and step out of our comfort zone to create some changes. Otherwise, nothing is going to change if we keep waiting for 6 years and 6 years and 6 years and down the line. Obviously think systemically about issues. That means don't only think about race, but think about racism, because we know that race and our understandings of race change across time. Don't think about only gender, think about genderism. And if you're not sure about what that means, then Google it. I Google things, faculty Google things, and there's nothing wrong with it. We need to all be able to talk about these topics together. Engage in our communities. Don't think that universities are the preeminent spaces of thinking. Our communities and folks who engage in these struggles every day, that maybe some of us do, but some of us don't because of the privileges that we have to have full-time working class jobs in the ivory tower. We don't always see everything that's going on. And with that, when I think about community also, not just from a space of like learning and change, but being kind, right? Like say hi to people, talk to each other, extend grace, create opportunities, share resources, think in expansive coalitions. And I think the last thing I would suggest for people who want to advocate for racial justice, particularly people who maybe are not as literate in thinking about racial justice or aren't sure how to engage currently, is to ask really good questions. So when we don't feel empowered to make statements or to utilize our capital for whatever reason, and we see something that's amiss, I always tell my students and folks that I know to just ask a really good question. As simple as the question is like, why do we do that? Or why is that the way it is? Or have we ever thought about X? And I think it really forces other people to do the work, and it prompts reflection and hopefully change, particularly as a minoritized person who asks a good question. It takes off a little bit of the stress and some of those emotional costs of activism, because it forces somebody else to do the work while you're still able to get your point across, or your thinking across at least. So I'd say those are some kind of starting points for racial justice, and I'm sure there are many other calls that we can make, I guess, for action. But I think those are, hopefully some helpful starting points.
Yes, I think those are wonderful starting points. Thank you for giving us so much food for thought. Again, today we've been discussing how to reframe racial justice with Dr. Dian Squire.
For more information about racial equity and justice in educational settings, we recommend that you visit Dr. Dian Squire's website at Iowa State University for a list of publications. For more podcasts, links to today's recommended resources, or to share your comments and suggestions, visit OCCRL.illinois.edu/democracy or send them via Twitter at OCCRL. Tune in next month when Angel Luis Velez from OCCRL will talk to Dr. Michelle Espino from the University of Maryland on understanding Latino educational pathways. Background music for this podcast is provided by DubLab. Thank you for listening and for your contribution to educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students.